And very good morning to you all, brothers in the Dhamma, brothers in the Dharma. Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim, for our friends in India especially. So this weekend is devoted to, the way of the liberated wanderers. And what we are going to be focusing on particularly is the Buddha and his early disciples. It's a weekend in a way about the origins of our tradition, in a way where we come from as Buddhists, even though that was a world very, very different from ours, unimaginably different. I made that joke about the Buddha didn't need this. I mean, imagine a world without technology, without all the gadgets that we have nowadays, without so many of the things that we take for granted. That's the world in which the Buddha lived and taught. And yet in many ways, he was dealing with the same human beings, with the same issues that we have, the same problems that we have. But it was a very, very different world. And it's very important, I think, to contemplate that. And very often I think people find it hard to contemplate because we can't be like the Buddha. I mean, not just in terms of his outstanding attainment. Enlightenment is absolutely outstanding, unprecedented. And not just in terms of the fact that he went forth from home into homelessness, like so many of his disciples, lived as a wanderer, complete renunciation. I mean, none of us live like that. And I think sometimes we can get a bit frightened almost of contemplating the Buddha's example and the example of his immediate disciples, because we think, well, I can't be like that, and why should they be like that? I've heard even people sort of arguing about the fact that the Buddha left home, left family, wandered off alone, and people are getting very agitated about that, even though they say they're Buddhists. We have to learn to be able to contemplate and revere and rejoice, understanding that we can't necessarily imitate that. We've got to find ways of translating that life, that example, into our lives with all its manifold responsibilities and demands. It's very, very important to do that. I sometimes say that the real shadow of Buddhism in the modern world, it's not sort of murky scandals. It's the fact that the Buddha went forth. The fact that he was a renunciate. How many people really want to look at that? Really want to look at that life of single-minded devotion to the attainment of enlightenment. That gets repressed, even though that is at the centre of the Buddhist tradition. So it's very important, I think, to contemplate the purity, if you like, of this very, very early, almost archaic, pre-Buddhistic Buddhism, as Sangharakshita has called it. And I use that term from a seminar that he led on a text called the Udana, in this old translation by F.L. Woodward, M.A., the minor anthologies of the Pali canon, as it's translated from the Khuddha Nikaya. That photograph shows him holding that book in his hands. Holding that book in his hands in a tent in Cornwall, where he was on a sort of retreat in a kind of chalet by the cliffside. And a group of order members, very early order members, this is 1974 we're talking about, went down and did this seminar with him under canvas in Cornwall. And there he is, with his long hair, his jacket. I think he's wearing maybe some jeans or loons or something, or cords or bell-bottom cords. I don't know. I can't remember. He went through different sort of sartorial phases, Bhante. And he's wearing rings. You can see rings on his fingers, which people would give him. People wanted him to bless them, these sort of hippie types. And he said, well, give me something and I'll wear it and then I'll give it back to you. So there are the rings on his fingers. And yes, there he was under canvas, leading study on this very, very early text. I'll come back to that in a moment. One interesting story about this, it was a mixed order gathering under canvas, and Dhamma Dinar, very senior Dhammacharini who lives in Bethnal Green, lives near the London Buddhist Centre in a community, very senior order member. She told us once that Bhante would leave, Sangharakshita would leave where they were having the retreat, the big tent, to go back to his place. It was evening time, and as soon as he left, an owl came and stood on a branch and just watched them. And they used to joke, oh, he's keeping an eye on us. The sort of thing you thought in those days. You really did think those kinds of things when you were around your teacher in those days, thinking your mind was being read and all that kind of thing. I think probably we were so transparent, we were probably quite easy to read, but certainly that was, but anyway, I'd better not dwell too much on that. But it's very interesting, isn't it? It's also, I'm talking about the origins of our Triratna, or Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, as we called it then. We didn't have this. We didn't have Papaloka. That happened, it started in 1976 and has developed over the years. We didn't have the London Buddhist Centre. We didn't have the Manchester Buddhist Centre, Sheffield Buddhist Centre, had none of those things. It was a very, very small, unformed grouping. It had been in existence for not even 10 years. And it's very, very interesting the way Bhante reads the Udana. Udana means verse of uplift, because at the end of each story about the Buddha, very short stories about the Buddha, there is an inspired saying. And Udana means something like the upward moving breath or the upward moving wind. And it's as if the Buddha is speaking under the force of tremendous inspiration. Something has happened and out comes this breathing forth in very, very short, direct verses, very hard to replicate in any kind of English translation. They have much more force in Pali, very, very stripped down. It's interesting, the Buddha, spoke poetry, and they're very old verses, very archaic Pali, apparently. So Sangharakshita reads this text in a very interesting way. He reads it as really trying to, as one of the records that we have in these Pali texts, because when you look at Buddhist literature, it sort of develops. It has sort of layers of, scholastic repetition down the ages. But he reads the Udana as really trying to get back to, you're sort of seeing through the layers of tradition to the most, in a way, the freshest stage in the development of the Dharma. The most sort of, the sort of purest things. The doctrine isn't entirely formed. You can sort of see that in the language. The Buddha's terminology is much more, unformed. It's not so systematized. And you can see a sort of community evolving. Well, of course, that was what was happening with our Sangha in those days. Sangharakshita had come back from India. He'd operated pretty much within Buddhist traditions in his own way, and here he was in London, especially in the UK, in the 60s and 70s, a kind of sort of explosion of change. And he realised he had to, as it were, work out a Dharma, work out a way of communicating. And this wasn't just self-conscious like that. It was immediate, it was responsive. How does the Dharma translate in a manner that really is tuned up to the individuals coming along now under very different circumstances? And so he sort of you can see what's going on when you look through the seminar. And it's been edited and published in the complete works. I forget which volume it's in, but it's the section, I think it's called Revival of Buddhism in India 2. And it's the section called Wisdom Before Words, Wisdom Before Words. It's a very, very good read. And you really get a feeling for what it might have been like to be around the Buddha. And the Udana begins with enlightenment, or rather, it begins post-enlightenment. You have the Buddha at Uruvela in the forest, seated beneath the Bodhi Tree, having just won, having just attained, realized the highest enlightenment, full and perfect enlightenment, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. And then it says he spends 7 days in one posture, enjoying the bliss of liberation, the Vimokha Sukha. 7 days without moving, in one posture, enjoying the bliss of liberation. Incredibly important detail. You know, it's very, very important when you read Buddhist texts, especially early Buddhist texts. They can seem they're very sober. They're very, in a way, careful. There's a lot of emphasis on renunciation. But here, right at the beginning, in one of the oldest texts, we have the Buddha sitting for 7 days in the bliss of liberation. And then he starts to turn his mind to what he's seen, what this enlightenment consists in. What is it? Articulating that to himself at a sort of lower level, in a sense, if you can speak about lower levels when it comes to the Buddha. Because enlightenment, of course, is beyond all language, all words. It's a Takavachara, beyond the sphere of reasoning. There's no words can go up to enlightenment and then just vanish. They just vanish. There's no words for Buddhahood. Very, very important to bear that in mind. Even to say that enlightenment beyond words is wrong, in a sense, because that's using words, isn't it? You get this sometimes, clever people going on about the ineffability of nirvana and the enlightenment's beyond the intellect, but that's just purely intellectual. That's just an idea. That's why you had to have the Chan masters and the Zen masters giving people a good slap, when they trot out these, this silly intellectual talk, these games. It's not real, so they bring them back to a dose of reality in itself with a thump. It's that sort of thing. I'm not advocating that, by the way. I wouldn't do that myself. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm just saying that's the Zen tradition. But yes, it's beyond words. But then, of course, he has to articulate it. It's no good it just remains beyond words, because you're in a world where you need to understand, you need to communicate, you need to make known. So it said what he then does is to start to articulate, and what he comes up with is an extraordinarily prosaic sounding formula. This being, that becomes, on the arising of this, that arises, this not being, that does not become, on the ceasing of this, that ceases. This is, of course, the expression of what's called praticca samutpada, conditioned co-production, dependent arising. That there's nothing in the whole of existence that is fixed and unchanging. Everything is a flow of ever-changing conditions which give rise to further conditions. Not understanding this, of course, is why not understanding it, I don't mean understanding it just intellectually, but not living this, realizing this, is why we suffer so. Why we get so caught up in our games and our habits, because we don't see that our actions have consequences, that there are conditions arising and giving rise to further conditions. Then he goes further. He starts to, the text says, he then sees that general vision of conditionality, which again is beyond language really. You try to see, conditioned co-production. You realize that itself is beyond all language. It's a vision out of time, in a sense, out of space, applied to, the particulars of lives, particularly seeing how involved people are in their suffering and what brings about their suffering again and again. He sees, particularly the text says, the Nidana chain. But it's a vision. It's seeing the way things are directly, which he's articulating to himself. And the Udana text, there's 3 bodhisattvas. And the last one is a vision of conditionality, everything coming into being, everything going out of being. And the Udana that comes out of it, it goes like this. Then on realizing the meaning of this, the Bhagavan, the Lord, uttered on that occasion this inspired utterance. When reality becomes clear and opens to the blazing, meditating Brahmin, he stands scattering Mara's army like the sun filling the sky with splendid light. That seems better. And in the Pali, it's got real force to it, which isn't replicated here. So these are the earliest utterances of the Buddha. You notice that word, this word Brahmin that's used. It's very, very interesting because, of course, in India, Brahmins they regard themselves as the highest caste. What the Buddha is trying to do, he's trying to find a word, a name, a label to describe the enlightened man. The word Buddha hasn't sort of appeared yet. The word Tathagata hasn't appeared yet. He uses a word to hand for somebody who is regarded as a superior man, and he tries to give it new life, saying the real superior man is the enlightened man. It's very interesting. It drops out of the scriptures. It's as if the old meaning of, you're a Brahmin because you're born into a Brahmin family, just couldn't be broken down. But the Buddha tries to use it. Sangharakshita even thinks his use of the Brahmin harks back to an earlier use of the word, that the Brahmin is like the shaman, the inspired seer of the tribe, who goes out on his own into the jungle to discover special knowledge to bring back to the community. But it doesn't work. So there's this whole, again, you've got this whole sort of language. What language do you use to communicate an unprecedented experience, an unprecedented realization? What language do we use in English or in other languages now, modern languages, to communicate deep, profound, spiritual experiences, very intimate experiences? What language do we use? It's a challenge for us sometimes, isn't it? You can have that experience when you get into the Dharma, and it's incredibly meaningful for you. In even the Buddhist words, they mean so much to you, but they don't quite, perhaps, do it for you. And you're trying to explain that to people you're very close to friends, to family, and they just don't get it. They just don't get it. It's very frustrating. This is why we're so fortunate to have Sangha, real spiritual friends, are those who we can communicate intimately with about our deepest, our most profound experiences. So the Buddha is trying to use the language, but this word Brahmin doesn't work. Sangharakshita, I'm going to read you a bit from the seminar from Bhante so that you can have a sense of how he reads, because I was going to read the actual Pali text or the translation of the text, and you realise how sort of clunky it can sound, but it's probably better that I've just tried to evoke it. Read the seminar. So this is what he says. So talking about these 7 days, what one can be sure of is that there was a tremendous inner absorption for a very long time. After all, the Buddha had gained enlightenment. He had been looking for it for so many years, and at last he was there. So all his energy poured into that like a waterfall falling from a tremendous height. Everything goes over. There's nothing left behind. It's amazing, isn't it? Everything goes over. Nothing is left behind. If you want enlightenment, everything has got to go over. Nothing is left behind. It's quite conceivable that it was only after some days that he even started directing his attention to the nature of existence. Maybe that was at a slightly lower level, or at least a different dimension, a different facet of the whole experience. The formula as it stands is very cut and dried, but I'm sure the Buddha didn't see things in that way. He saw the whole vast process of individual existence, how it comes into existence, develops and passes away, and how the whole thing is involved with suffering. But he didn't sit down and say to himself, oh yes, first of all comes ignorance, and then there's the formations. He saw it in one great flash, as it were, in a vivid and immediate fashion. The narrative and the verse create a picture or even tell a story of the inspired seer, almost the primitive shaman, becoming completely possessed with what he has seen and bursting out with the expression of it. The Buddha has just become enlightened. For a whole week, he has experienced the bliss of release, the bliss of liberation. And then he looks around at existence and sees that everything arises in dependence upon causes. This is such a tremendous insight, such a revelation, that he burst forth with his Udana. So I think that's such a vivid evocation of the Buddha's enlightenment, based on just a few pages in this old book, this early translation of the Udana, really trying to convey to these young people, the original young people, if you like, of Triratna, in this tent in Cornwall, really trying to communicate the inspiration that comes out of Buddhahood, out of enlightenment. And the rest of the Udana, it's a very, very interesting collection. He says it's probably the nearest thing we've got to a sort of gospel in the Pali canon. It's not a life story of the Buddha. The events spread over a number of books, a number of settings, sort of move around in time, but they do sort of follow the Buddha towards parinirvana, towards what we would call his death, his passing away. But what's attractive about it is that you have all these different stories, all these different interactions, sometimes with his own wandering disciples who've gone forth, sometimes with householder disciples, and sometimes with very poor people, sometimes with kings, with men and women. The Buddha living in the forest, because that's so important as well, living in nature, moving from place to place, communicating what he's seen, communicating enlightenment, not just through words, but through his very, very, very being, through his presence. It's a very, very attractive collection, and I'd really encourage you to read, especially Bhante's seminar on this, in Wisdom Before Words. So I said that term Brahmin, the Buddha stops using it as the Pali canon goes on. Clearly the caste meaning comes back. And it's very interesting in the Pali canon because not the sutta that comes, in the Udana, the sutta that comes after these suttas on enlightenment is an encounter with a Brahmin. There he is, the Buddha's in the forest, meditating. And by the way, when we picture the Buddha, this is very important, don't picture him wearing neatly kind of ironed, orange, beautiful, sort of saffron, crocus coloured robes, and he's got gold skin and all that kind of thing. That wouldn't be what he looked like. He would have been wearing rag robes, discoloured with earth. He would have been quite dark, his complexion. Remember, he'd lived out in the open. He'd done all those ascetic practices. He wouldn't have been, you see some in popular Indian depictions, he's got sort of pinky, rosy cheeks, really weird. No, he would have been dark. He would have been dark-skinned, very lean, might have had stubble, bit of a beard, maybe his hair was a bit longer. Very, very hard to kind of picture the Buddha in the earliest tradition, but certainly no ecclesiastical robes, nothing like that. None of that has come in. Very important to remember. And interesting that Sangharakshita, here he's got long hair, he's wearing ordinary dress, he stopped wearing robes. He did wear them ceremonially, but he just wanted to wear what people were wearing, to be able to communicate with people. This is very important. A friend of mine, Buddhadasa, who actually led me in the Udana, in study of Udana, Friday nights in the earliest Brighton Buddhist Centre upstairs in the library, in the attic. He'd been on this seminar. He said that Sangharakshita once said, well, if the Buddha was around today, he would have worn a t-shirt and jeans. I mean, I never heard Bhante say that, but Buddhadasa is pretty reliable. He would have wanted to communicate, to be with the people he was with. Very, very interesting. So be clear about the picture of the Buddha seated in the jungle. And somebody comes to him. Somebody from the village has heard about this holy man in the jungle, seated there. And he's a Brahmin of the Hunkara persuasion, has faith in chanting Hum, although it could also be translated as a man who went around grumpily saying, in a conceited fashion. So he came to him and said, you know, what makes one a Brahmin? What makes one the highest caste? This was the question. In India, having lived in India, people are very concerned about your status. Travelling with Indian friends, on a train, long train journey, the other people in the carriage ask these very, very leading questions of my friends. What is your name? Where do you come from? Trying to work out where they are in the caste system. Very, very interesting. And, even my status, what are your qualifications? So I don't actually have any qualifications whatsoever. They're a little bit shocked that I haven't got a PhD or something like that. And, what is your salary? And I've never had a salary in my life. And so on and so forth. Everybody's kind of wanting to work out where you are in the pecking order. So he wants to know, what makes a Brahmin? What makes the highest man? And the Buddha comes back really strongly. It's nothing to do with birth. Nothing to do with birth. It's to do with your quality. It's to do with your worth. It's to do with an absence of conceit. It's very pointed. You've got no arrogance, no conceit. That you're learned and you live well and you treat others well. And this particular encounter is marked at Bodh Gaya. You can go to the very spot where this took place. And our Buddhist friends in India, of course, who come from Dalit backgrounds, this is where the Dhamma Revolution began. Right after the Enlightenment. This is really significant that the Buddha saw or communicated immediately the social implications of enlightenment, even the political implications of enlightenment. Immediately, enlightenment is coming into relationship with the world. It's got nothing to do with your what family you've been born into, what community you've been born into, what makes you a man, what makes you a real man, a higher man, a higher person, is your quality, is your ethics, your learning, your humanity. That's what makes you a real human being. Very, very powerful moment. And it's very important to remember that. When we meditate on and we think about the Buddha and we think about enlightenment, all these sort of very, very high, profound, highly intellectual expressions sometimes of enlightenment, that have developed down the centuries. Let's not forget that it's about something deeply, profoundly human that cuts through, that transcends, that breaks through all the artificial divisions that we put between ourselves and others. which of course is what the Buddha was concerned to communicate for the rest of his life, to so many different kinds of people in so many different ways. But I'm going to carry on with this, I'm going to leave the Udana just for a little while, and I'm going to go to the Vinaya. I'm going to go to the Vinaya. The Vinaya is usually thought of as being the collection which is concerned with the discipline, especially the discipline of the monks. And there's so many books in it which are full of all sorts of rules and regulations of the monks, which probably the Buddha didn't actually teach, which developed down the centuries and down the ages. But the Vinaya is interesting for other reasons, because it's concerned again with the origins of the tradition. Where does ordination come from? What's the pedigree of the Buddhist lineage? And it tells the life of the Buddha again from the Enlightenment. You even have things which are very close to the Udana at the beginning of the Vinaya. You have the story of the Buddha teaching the Dharma to his old 5 friends, the Dharma Chakra Pravartana. But I want to jump to what happens next. So we're very, very early on in the Buddha's dispensation. And there's a wonderful story. And it's the story of somebody called Yasa in Sanskrit. And Yasa, as far as we know, had absolutely no interest in a higher life. He was a young merchant's son. And his mother and father, as it's said in India, merchants really spoil their sons, their oldest sons especially, so I've been told. And he had everything. He didn't have to work. He had, palaces, and, he could just enjoy himself thoroughly. It was rainy season, towards the end of the rainy season. And basically he was in his palace with his servants and minstrels, and there were no men among them. It was just gorgeous women attending his every need, and they had a party. It's rainy season, it's quite hot, it's quite humid, very lush. The rainy season is often the time of love and all that kind of thing, according to some Indian traditions. And it's a big party, with him and these young women who are playing for him with these instruments and singing songs. And it's towards the end of the night, and he wakes up. There's just a single lamp burning, casting all sorts of shadows around the place. And he looks around at the women who are all asleep, all splayed over their instruments and over the divans, snoring, muttering in their sleep. And he sees it all very differently. He's overwhelmed with disgust. Disgust for himself, I think, as much as anything. Well, mostly with himself and the life that he's leading. And he completely freaks out. That's not the term they use in the Pali Canon. He just feels horrified at what he's seeing. The candlelight, casting weird shapes on the walls, these people that he's been attracted to, feeling this sort of sense of horror and revulsion. And he just kept shouting out, "It's horrible. It's terrible." His hair's standing on end, his skin's crawling. There's a lovely Marathi word, Sangharakshita, is Bhayankar. That's what you would have been saying, which means sort of horrible, terrible, Bhayankar. And he's really, really upset, and he just rushes out. He just rushes out into the night, doesn't know where he's going. He's off, out, just shouting, "It's horrible, it's terrible, Bhayankar, Bhayankar," going completely mad. What, of course, he's experiencing is in the tradition, a term that we don't often dwell on, is samvega. Samvega, which is very, very hard to translate. One writer translates it as aesthetic shock. Aesthetic shock, it's that feeling when you suddenly wake up to the hollowness of your existence. And you're not living as you know you should be living. It's not guilt or anything like that. It's regarded as an important spiritual experience, a spiritual moment, where you see through the shallowness of your life. Sometimes we want to resist that Sangharakshita. We think, well, something's so shocking, so painful, there must be something wrong with that. But actually, no, you've got to, if it is Sangharakshita, if it is that shock at the utter superficiality of your life. I feel it in shopping malls. Or when I used to come down from Guijueloca, our retreat centre in Spain, into Alicante airport, I'd be overwhelmed with sort of shock and horror, and even the sort of people I was standing with, sort of sunburnt Brits, going home after a depressing holiday. I mean, I then had to realise I've been transferring merits every day for just these very beings, and I had to look again at their terrible suffering. But yes, Sangharakshita, well worth investigating that. Don't be frightened, even though it is frightening. Don't be frightened of looking into that sense of, the illusory nature, the delusory nature of life, and how hollow it is and how shallow it is. For him, he just goes. He runs out shouting, it's horrible, it's horrible. And somehow or other, he finds his way to the deer park, where the Buddha is sitting out in the open, enjoying the night. The Buddha loved silence. He loved sitting out under trees. And this time, end of the rainy season, is so lush in India. It's full of scents and sounds, insects, birds. It's such a rich, beautiful time of year. It's quite warm. So he's sitting out in the open. Presumably it's not raining. The rains have stopped. And he sits there, and this lad he sees coming to him going, "It's horrible, it's terrible, Bhayankar, Bhayankar." And the Buddha just says, "This is not horrible. This is not terrible." And just those words, he just stops. This, one word, this is not horrible. In the Dhammapada, in the section on the thousands, it says, better than 1,000 meaningless words is one word that brings peace, that brings calm. One word that goes to the heart. One word, this. What is this? The Buddha can just say this, and it does something. Because, of course, it's coming from enlightenment, coming from the freshness and the depth of enlightenment. This is not horrible. Sit down, take a seat, and I'll communicate with you. I'll tell you more. And in that communication, Yasha is so open. He enters the stream. He becomes irreversible from Buddhahood. There's another story that also starts to go on in this section from the Vinaya. It's mum and dad. Mum wakes dad up saying, "Our son's gone, you've got to go and find him." So dad, has to rush out, to find his son, thinking his son's been kidnapped or been eaten or something's happened, and even sees his golden slippers lying in the grass and, is beside himself. The Buddha sees the father coming and knows that if the father comes, Yasha, though he's entered the stream, will want to go home. So the Buddha makes him disappear. Buddha could do that. He sort of creates a kind of protective mandala so he can carry on with his meditation and push on to full enlightenment, to become an arahant. Very, very important to have this side of things in the Buddha. Is sometimes the Pali texts are very rational, which is great, very important, very clear, but there's a magical quality as well. And the father says, "Have you seen my son?" And the Buddha says, "Well, sit down and maybe he'll appear." And the Buddha starts to talk to the father. The father enters the stream. Yasha can then appear and tell his father that he's become enlightened. And the father says, "Come home, bring life, give life to your mother." He said, "But I can't, because I can't go back to that. I'm enlightened. Long story short, the whole family becomes stream entrants. And then all of Yasha's friends hear about what Yasha's up to. They're all merchant sons. They're all, sort of playboys, good time guys, They all become monks. They all become full-time followers of the Buddha. It's a really what it's communicating. Whether it was literally like that, we don't really know. But you can be sure what it's communicating is this sort of explosion of the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha's sasana, the Buddha's communication. There's an inspiration and an energy. So many people are attracted and sparked off. They want to be part of this. The Buddha seems to have had this sort of electric, magnetic quality that people wanted to be around, giving clear teaching, clear instruction which they could use and apply to their lives. And eventually there's over 60 enlightened disciples, and there's this very, very important moment, really important moment that occurs when this particular gathering develops, where the Buddha says, I am free of all fetters, whether human fetters or the fetters that come from higher meditation, the divine fetters. I'm liberated, I'm enlightened. You too are free from all fetters, human or divine. You too are enlightened. Go forth, go. Let two of you not take the same path. So each of you go singly, separately, to communicate this higher life, this Dhamma life, this spiritual life. Good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. For the welfare and the happiness of all people, of the many people. This is again a very significant moment. The welfare and happiness of the many people, all the people, is Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai. Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai. Bahujan, again, we don't get the full force of it in English. Bahujan is an anti-caste term. It's not recognized, it's a term that doesn't recognize any caste distinction, any kind of artificial distinction. This is for the people. The Dhamma is for all the people, everybody. And you communicate, later the Buddha says, you communicate it in their language, both literally and metaphorically. He was once asked by a Brahmin, can we turn your teachings into wonderful, perfect, classical Sanskrit shlokas? And the Buddha said, no, we're not doing that. Of course, you do get a Buddhist Sanskrit developing, but long after the Buddha's time, no, we're not turning it into some artificial language, like Latin. Not that he knew what Latin was, but you know what I mean. No, people must learn the Dhamma in their language. Buddha probably spoke more than one language, more than one dialect. Probably spoke Magadhan, he probably would have spoken the language that was current in the different countries, basically, he was moving through when he was communicating the Dharma. Communicating in words that people could actually use in their life. And this is reflected throughout the Pali texts. When he's talking with farmers, he can communicate to them as farmers. When he's communicating with housewives, he can communicate with them as housewives. When he's with kings, he can communicate with them as kings. He gets the Dharma through to their circumstances and situations. And it goes on. I was going to tell you many, many more stories from these Pali texts, but time is short. And I want you to, very important that you have the discussion groups. So I think I need to start winding things up. I mean, I hope in this you've got at least a flavour of the early Sangha, of the Buddha and his early disciples and what it was like. And I hope also you've got a bit of a flavour of how Bhante was in, communicating things to us. Communicating in a way that would get through to us. And of course, he wasn't just teaching from the Udana, he was drawing on the entire Buddhist tradition, finding a way of translating that in the fullest sense, not just the literal word translation, but the spirit of the Dharma in a form that we could use in our lives. And in some ways, I think we were, although very different looking back, we were not unlike those early disciples, those, the playboy disciples of the Yasha and his friends coming out of the merchant communities, or just dropouts. I mean, sometimes the Buddha does communicate with wanderers who've dropped out of society. They weren't following the Buddha originally. They were off with somebody else, or just wandering. It seems that India of the day had this very rich culture of what are known as the Shramanas. The Shramanas were sort of these non-Brahmin wanderers living freely to try and work out the truth, with very weird and wonderful views sometimes, it has to be said. So people who just sort of dropped out. Well, in a way, we were like that. A lot of us had just sort of given up on the train tracks that seemed to be laid down for us by our parents. And we lived, and we could live. It was easier sort of sociologically in those days to live very, very simply. I remember when I lived in North London, in Archway, our only centre in London at that time, before we had the London Buddhist Centre, when that was being converted from the old fire station into a fantastic Buddhist centre. I lived in squats, communities of Buddhists in these sort of semi-legal squats. I mean, it helped that we were in the London Borough of Camden under Ken Livingstone. He didn't seem to mind that kind of thing in those days. We'd move into these areas of redevelopment, the electricity would go on, the water would go on, we'd pay our rates, our electricity bills, and we lived very, very simply. I mean, I could work a couple of days a week down the Holloway Road, to support myself, just to support myself to work for the Dharma. I mean, we can't do that now, but it was out of things like this, very, very simple living, that all this has come. And it's very important to remember that. I'm not nostalgic about those days, by the way, just to be very clear. I much prefer Triratna today, because we were very immature, and when you have a lot of immature people together, well, you know what happens in all sorts of ways. It's a much broader and richer world we're in. The only time is now, in a sense. But it's important to remember and honour the pioneers of those days, our early Sangha, and what Bhante was like. It was his vision and inspiration and teaching that wasn't, in those days, particularly systematised. It was clear. The meditation practices were clear. The ethical practices were clear, if you like. The philosophy was clear. But it wasn't all, we didn't have the 3-year Mitra study course, all that kind of thing, ordination processes. It was quite unformed. It's good that it's become more formed, but what we were inspired by was a vision. So the Udana, to come back to that and to start winding up, takes us through to the Buddha moving towards parinirvana. There are passages in the Udana which you find in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So the Buddha's very old. He's in his 80s, he's very sick. He says to Ananda that he's in pain all the time. He said, I'm old, I'm aged, fully 80 years, I'm like an old cart that can only keep going by being strapped up. He's holding it together, holding the skandhas together, always in pain, unless he's withdrawn in the signless samadhi, which he can have immediate access to. There's no pain in the signless samadhi that comes out of profound absorption in the flow of things, in the impermanent nature of things. And when he's walking around, he is in pain, but he never loses his mindfulness and clear comprehension, his sense of purpose. And the purpose is to keep communicating the Dharma, to keep moving through the countries of northern India, through the regions of northern India, communicating the Dharma to whoever wants it, whoever needs it, teaching right up to his last days. But we don't go to his final days, but we do have a parinirvana, a final enlightenment in the Udana. It's quite an extraordinary one. And it concerns a disciple of the Buddha named Dabba. Dabba of the Mullas being a community, a tribe that the Buddha had taught the Dharma in. And Dabba is quite interesting. His backstory is very interesting. He became ordained when he was 7. You could get ordained when you were 7 in the time of the Buddha. We can't do that these days. I think safeguarding might have something to say about that these days. But in the Buddha's day, you could get ordained at 7 because apparently you could get ordained when you could get a job. And apparently when you were 7, you could get a job. You could scare crows from the fields. So you could support yourself, so you could be ordained. Anyway, he got ordained when he was 7, quite a remarkable, bright young lad. And his ordination at the hands of the Buddha, I think, or certainly some of the Buddha's disciples, which would have been a very simple affair, but his ordination was so inspiring, he became enlightened. He became an arahant. Ordinations can be pretty good, but I don't know of anybody in our Sangha yet who were enlightened when they were ordained. Maybe, certainly, my own ordination was very vivid, very strong, but I can't say I didn't notice I was enlightened at that time. Anyway, he was enlightened, and after becoming an arahant, he thought, what is the best expression of my enlightenment? To serve the Sangha. Very interesting. Not spend all my time meditating, thinking how wonderful my enlightenment is. To serve the Sangha. And in particular, he decided he wanted to serve in terms of welcoming members of the order when they'd come to retreat. He seems to have decided that he was going to, as well as wander when he got to retreat places like the Jeta Grove or something like that, he would then be a welcomer to the wanderers coming in. He also mastered the fire element, Dabba. Very interesting, fire. Fire in the ancient tradition is a very mysterious, mystical quality. It's not like our own notions of fire. In those days, fire is always present. It's always present. It's just activated by certain other conditions. It's a subtle element, the fire element, the heat element. Very, very interesting. This is why when you look up the etymology of Nibbana, which can mean the blowing out of a flame, you have to read that not in our materialistic ways of reading fire. You blow out the gross flame, but there's something subtle, mysterious, hidden, the Mahabhuta, the great ghost of fire. In the same way, you might not be able to see and perceive Buddhahood, but there's something there, mysterious, which you can perhaps sense, but not know with the intellect. Anyway, he masters fire. He masters fire. I don't know what this consisted in, presumably meditating a lot on the fire element, so he becomes the master of it. But this mastery of fire, he employed in the service of the monks coming for lodgings. And the story goes that monks would come from afar after their wanderings, and they'd come to Dabba and they'd say, Dabba, we want to stay far away in the jungle. And they'd always turn up at night if they knew he was going to be there. They'd always turn up at night. Let's go far, far away, because they wanted to see a wonder. Because as they went into the darkness of the forest, Dabba would hold up his finger and a flame would arise from it, and he would be like a lamp showing the way to their lodging. It's an incredible image, a light going into the darkness of the forest. It has its own sort of symbolism. Maybe we shouldn't take that so literally. Anyway, he was the master of the fire element, and he decides that it's time for his parinirvana. This would sometimes happen in the Pali text. It could sometimes be associated with sickness, where monks would be sick, and you can imagine in a world without the medicines we have now, sickness could be very debilitating, overwhelmingly painful. There's plenty of stories of that in the Pali text. And people would want to go. And the Buddha said, well, it's okay to go, providing you've at least entered the stream. You're irreversible. You can't take your life before then. You can't do that, because you still need to work on yourself. But Dhamma was an arahant, no problem. So he said to the Buddha, he came to the Buddha, Bhante, it's time for my parinirvana. You bless me to take my parinirvana. So even though he was enlightened, the Buddha was enlightened, Dhamma still regarded the Buddha as his teacher. Bhante, it's time. The Buddha says, do what you think it's time for, Dhamma. So he sits cross-legged, he rises up into space, and the fire element, he gets absorbed in the fire element, and he just goes up in flames. And then the flames vanish. It's an extraordinary image. A man going up into space, bursting into flames. There's no soot, there's no ash, there's nothing left over. Nothing remains. The last fire has just vanished into space. It's an incredible sort of image of parinirvana, going up into flames, into space, vanishing. And the Buddha comments on this. This is in fact the last words of the Udana, and let's make it the last words of my talk. The last words of the talk really hinting at the unfathomable nature of the Buddha mind, of enlightenment itself, the unfathomable nature of the Buddha and his great disciples. Just as the future state of a blazing spark of fire struck from the anvil, gradually fading, cannot be known, so in the case of those who have won perfect liberation and crossed the flood of lusts that bind and reached unshakable bliss, the state they've won cannot be pointed to.